Hello viewers, thank you for joining me for my last video of the year. I did one of these last year too, and really enjoyed the chance to look back and reflect on some of the highlights. There are just a few things to cover before we get started. If you're new here, this is not the type of channel that covers every single anime that comes out every season, so this isn't a roundup of the best of 2024 or anything. Just a quick collection of my favorites from what I watched throughout the year. I try to keep my full reviews objective. This list will be swayed more by personal enjoyment than anything else. But as always, I hope you'll find something on here that piques your interest. Number 3 on the list is Terror in Resonance. I want to keep the plot synopsis sections fairly brief in this video, but there's no simple way to sum up this tale. There are 3 sides to this story. What tends to catch the eye first is the pair of teenage boys, going by the codenames 9 and 12, who break into a facility housing nuclear materials, which they use to enact a series of terrorist attacks on Tokyo. But it's not a matter of aimless destruction. Prior to each attack, they send a cryptic video message to the police, telling them they'll defuse the bombs themselves if the police can solve their riddles in the given time frame, hoping, of course, that someone will see past the game and figure out their true motive. Which is what brings Detective Shibazaki out of retirement. He's the perfect choice, as he was basically banished to the records department after unearthing some corruption in the government. He never got the chance to see that case through to the end, but he quickly makes some connections between it and 9 and 12's targets. The third viewpoint in this story is a high school girl named Lisa, thoroughly beaten down by the unfortunate circumstances of her home life and bullying at school. She encounters the boys by chance and quickly gets swept up into being a co-conspirator. Though she's probably the weakest part of this show, there is a subtle sort of beauty to watching her learn to find a sense of purpose in life through her interactions with 2 boys who've already given up on it. Terror in Resonance was like Death Note, but in a more realistic setting, and I didn't hate any of the main characters. I think anyone who liked that show would definitely enjoy the cat and mouse game between Shibazaki and the boys here. I have no complaints about the riddles not being tough enough, or the drama not being high stakes enough, or any of that. This is one of those shows where it really never felt like anyone was protected by plot armor, and I love to be kept on my toes like that. But by far, what really pushed this one over the edge for me was the ending, which makes a video where I'm trying to avoid spoilers a little difficult. I think the cornerstone of what makes this series work is that 9 and 12 are very sympathetic villains, if you're even willing to call them villains by the end. Once their background's been explored and you see the truth of their motive, the final point they make really struck a chord with me. There's nothing I love like a conclusion that makes me emotional. Terror in Resonance is the sort of bittersweet tragedy that dares its audience to question their sense of right and wrong, whether evil acts can be justified sometimes. And I love that sort of thing. If you skipped this one, I suggest giving it a chance. The journey comes together at the end to be something beautiful. Number 2 on my list is a show I didn't even put to a poll, because I figured it would completely blow away anything I tried to pair it up against. And clearly the hype was worth something, because it made a list of my favorites too. Violet Evergarden takes place in the fictional country of Leidenschaftlich, which is finally starting to recover after being at war for 4 long years. Our title character, Violet, is a young girl who was raised to be an emotionless tool for the war effort, so she's understandably lost now that the war's over and her job is done. Violet's final commanding officer was a man named Gilbert Bougainvillea, and he was pretty disturbed by this practice of turning orphans into war machines. He basically adopted Violet and did his best to encourage her to embrace her emotions and try to see a life beyond the war. But Major Gilbert's been missing, presumed dead, since the final battle, so once Violet's released from the hospital, she's taken in by one of his friends, who started up a postal company. Violet's enthralled by the auto-memory dolls she meets there, young women who transcribe letters for people who are either illiterate or just don't trust themselves to find the right words to get their emotions across. Wanting to understand her own emotions and properly live the life Gilbert envisioned for her, Violet starts work as an auto-memory doll herself, learning a little more about the world and its people and what it really means to love someone with each letter she writes. Just by the nature of this story, Violet Evergarden is a little more episodic than I usually prefer. Certain clients definitely stand out more than others, but there's the thread of her personal journey running throughout the whole thing, and you can really see her growing over time. In my full review, I feel like I didn't come across as being that crazy about this one, largely because I've seen character stories like Violet's more times than I can count. Now that I've had some time to reflect back on this one and get out of my own way a bit, I can't deny that Violet Evergarden really is something special. Because this takes place after the war, it's got a slice-of-life type feel to it that you don't usually get with stories that include characters like Violet. As a result, the story is able to focus almost exclusively on her rehabilitation, even if it is often through the eyes of her clients' lives and their troubles. And on a personal note, it's hugely satisfying to me that a story whose core purpose is about understanding what it truly means to love another person included almost no romance to speak of. These episodic stories are all about friendship and family, and that's possibly the most beautiful thing to me, though I will reiterate what I said in my review, that the animation is breathtaking in this one, truly KyoAni at their finest. I will say, there's a movie that's considered to be the canon conclusion to this series that's not bad, but I do think it's a little unnecessary. The anime season absolutely can stand alone, and I prefer the anime's ending personally. It's another one whose final episode never fails to get me emotional. Before we get to the final entry, I want to shout out a couple honorable mentions. First is Golden Kamuy, which brings us back to Japan in the early 1900s. Our main character is a man named Saichi Sugimoto, an ex-soldier who's just left the army following the end of the Russo-Japanese War. He got quite the reputation during the war, earning himself the nickname Immortal Sugimoto, but his best friend died in battle, and Sugimoto promised to look out for his wife if anything happened to him, so the story opens with Sugimoto panning for gold to get the money to pay for a surgery for her eyes, until he hears the tale of a stash of gold stolen from the Ainu, a group of indigenous people here in Hokkaido. The thief was caught and imprisoned, but his treasure remains lost, and he was kept alive because the government wants the gold as much as anyone else. Which is to their detriment, ultimately, as the thief teamed up with a bunch of the other prisoners and plotted a jailbreak. Each of the escaped prisoners was tattooed with a series of Ainu symbols. When put together, they should reveal a map to the gold. So Sugimoto teams up with a young Ainu girl named Ashirpa, whose father was involved in the theft, to get the gold back for her people, and they quickly run into conflicts with a rogue army division and a group of old samurai who are also hunting down the treasure. There's almost no end to the praise I have for this series. I love the historical setting. The twists and turns of the treasure hunt have kept me on guard in a really satisfying way. It can be super heartwarming and sweet one moment and shockingly brutal the next, but especially the characters. Sugimoto and Ashirpa's friendship is really beautiful. I love the way the series explores how haunted he is by the war and what he fears it's turned him into, and how he turns that around to try and shield Ashirpa from having to carry those burdens herself. But I also love the trust they have for each other and how she's continuously teaching him things and giving him a new perspective on life. And it's not just our main duo. I've lost track of just how many characters I thought would just be bit players when they were first introduced, only for them to come back in a major way and get these great, heart-wrenching backstories. What started as an almost educational sort of interest quickly slid down the slope towards becoming an obsession. But I spared myself from having to try to figure out just how Golden Kamuy shaped up against everything else I watched. Like with Drifting Home on last year's list, I'd kind of already decided that this one would be disqualified based on a technicality. Golden Kamuy was an experiment for me this year. I'd never reviewed something with this many seasons, and thus used it to help me get into a schedule where I could do more than one review each month. I got to spend so much more time with this series than any of the other shows it would have been competing against. I'm sure that affected the experience, and it just didn't seem fair. It's also not complete yet. I'm still waiting on news for when the final season will start airing. But I also knew that I would have to include it in some manner. Golden Kamuy is one of those shows that deserves to be so much more popular than it is. My other honorable mention this year is Hanasaku Iroha. After her mother runs off with her boyfriend to avoid debt collectors, a teenage girl named Ohana is sent to live with her grandmother in the countryside, who she's never met. When she arrives, she learns her mother's family runs an inn, and she'll be expected to earn her keep here. It's a little bit of a Cinderella story, as her grandmother's cold and professional, and she gets off to a rough start with the two other girls her age who work there. But Ohana is immediately likable and willing to work hard to find her place in this world. There's no magic in this one, and I'm not usually a huge fan of regular slice-of-life stories like this, but Hanasaku Iroha is definitely one of the best ones I've ever seen. I do love a good tale of complicated family relationships, which there's no shortage of in this one. What really made this series stand out was how realistically it handled those family troubles. Enjoyment-wise, that wasn't always a good thing. It means some things are left feeling a little unresolved. Some characters are forgiven when it might have been a little more cathartic to see them suffer. But they definitely feel like a real family trying to move forward in light of their past mistakes, and there's something special about that. And finally, my favorite anime that I watched this past year was Summertime Rendering, and I suspect I might lose some people with this one, so stay with me a minute. Summertime Rendering is the story of a boy named Shinpei as he returns to the island where he grew up for the funeral of his childhood friend Ushio. But a mystery starts to form the second he steps off the boat. Another old friend, whose father happens to be the doctor who did the autopsy, clues him into some evidence that was covered up, suggesting that her death wasn't the accidental drowning it's being passed off as. Then Ushio's little sister Mio tells him about the Shadow Sickness, an old legend on the island where creatures known as shadows would take the forms of the islanders, ultimately killing the originals to take their place. Mio claims Ushio saw her shadow a few days before her death. This might have been passed off as the ramblings of a grieving sister, except then the two go to talk to the priest at the shrine in the mountains, and instead of the priest, they find Mio's shadow, who quickly murders them both. Shinpei experiences some kind of vision of Ushio begging him to protect her sister, and then he wakes up back on the boat right before he arrived on the island, and the time loop commences. I want to say that on an objective level, I fully acknowledge that Terror in Resonance and Violet Evergarden are both more meaningful shows than this one, tackling issues that you'll likely be able to relate back to the real world. But on the pure enjoyment level I mostly used to judge this list, nothing I watched this year sucked me in the way Summertime Rendering did. Almost made me late for work several times because I just didn't want to put this one down. I love a good magic-tinged murder mystery. I love a good action-filled friendship story. I love a story that keeps me on my toes. This one has all of that. Every single episode was packed with twists and turns. I could rarely guess where it was going next, and there's always something satisfying about that. My only real complaint was that the ending was a little too perfect. But I'm not the kind of person who can really complain about a happy ending. I can always get my more cathartically tragic endings elsewhere. So there you have it. Those were the highlights of the year for me. This was the first year I used the polls to let you guys vote on what I would watch. I'm really enjoying that method of doing things. If this was your first experience with this channel, I leave the polls up for the first 3 days of each month, so feel free to check back in and lend your voice to February's pick. I hope this video gave you a chance to either reflect back on a series you loved, or maybe introduced you to something new. Thank you all for a great year, and thank you for watching.